right. Welcome back, everybody. Thanks for joining me. Hope you had a good day so far. This is my third talk, and this one's about the Yahoo user interface library itself. I actually normally don't talk about this. We kind of let it just kind of sell itself and kind of exist out there, but it's been requested a few times, so put together this talk. Hopefully it'll just give you an overview of kind of what's there and, again, kind of where to go for more information. This is the design track, so I took out a lot of the heavy code slides, and instead we'll just be focusing on kind of why we did it and what's involved. So more specifically, kind of 4 sections today: why we built it, kind of what we built, why we decided to give it away, and what you might like about it, why you might be interested in using it yourself. And shoot your hands up if you have questions throughout. So why did we build it? First and foremost, because it's kind of a changing time on the web. Things are moving from kind of low fidelity to high fidelity, from simple interfaces to much more complex interfaces. People expect much less online. We talked about that a little bit yesterday, how we've spent 10 years lowering expectations about what people can do online. But we all live online, and all of our value of our companies, or a lot of it anyhow, is online. And it's tied to the browser, even though the browser is a tough place to develop software. So we really needed to find a way to kind of level the playing field and make it possible and make it sane to do the types of things we wanted to do. When we started looking at that, we realized there were really two things that had to happen. First of all, we had to improve our technology. I've said it a few times now, the browser is a tough place to work. And here's a little bit why. If you're a web developer, web designer, these things will probably be familiar to you. A lot of us work on the server also. We kind of do that middle ground between the server and the client. But even if you don't count the server at all, there's all these knowledge areas that we have to know about and we have to kind of balance out. One of them is HTML. And that'd be fine if it was just HTML and it was the same everywhere, but it's not. There's more kind of subsets. First of all, you have to be familiar with the specification, kind of what's intended to be happening. And there's quite a bit there. You can go read all the W3C docs and kind of learn about the specification. But equally important is kind of what the different browser vendors chose to implement. So there's a delta between the specification and kind of what actually was implemented, or what they decided to implement. And then unfortunately, even though, for example, Microsoft decided not to implement all of the spec, they didn't actually even implement what they wanted to implement. There's a whole bunch of kind of defects, even once they had a plan. So now we've got these two deltas from specification to implementation, and then having to keep track of all the different defects that exist in that implementation. And so as we kind of look across those 3 areas, they're kind of a theory and a practice of kind of the best way forward kind of emerges. And so this is just for HTML, but the same thing exists for other knowledge areas, like the document object model, CSS, and the browser object model, and their APIs, JavaScript, data transportation. So you can see in our heads we're already tracking so many things. This is what makes it fairly difficult to do complex development online. And that's what you have to keep in mind if you were just doing a single browser on a single operating system. But as you all know, we're working across multiple operating systems with multiple user agents per operating system. So now we've just kind of exponentially compounded the amount of things we're keeping track of. So you take those 7 knowledge areas, just for fun, some kind of pseudo math here. Those 7 knowledge areas, each with kind of 4 dimensions to them, across 3 different platforms, a couple browsers per platform. And I didn't even mention that each browser has different rendering modes, Quirks mode or strict mode. So we've got to keep track of those things too. So in our heads every day when we get to work, we're trying to kind of make sense of all these different moving parts. So clearly we need kind of a new platform for doing that, a more robust way to kind of bring some sanity to all that sort of madness. And then the second thing that's really important to do is to raise users' expectations. We want users to feel confident. We want them to explore. We want them to kind of engage with all of our services and content online. And that's not really just a development problem or a design problem. It really involves both groups kind of working together. On the design side, I think the biggest shift going on now is the ability to deliver mental models instead of implementation models. And an example of that is on a classic webmail interface. If you wanted to take a message from your inbox and move it to your saved folder or to some other folder in your system, you had no choice but to use the kind of the underlying implementation details that were involved in that process. So typically you would find your message and you would tick the checkbox next to that message. Then you would go locate the form element that listed all your folders, pull that down and pick which folder you wanted, hit the submit button, wait for that round trip to happen. So the technology was such that we had no way to shield users from that. but today we kind of do, and so we're much more able to deliver the mental model of what the user had in mind. So nowadays, in a more sophisticated, modern webmail client, you just take your message and you drag it to whatever folder you're interested in. And that's really liberating for users. They don't have to learn all kind of the nuance of the underlying technology. We can just deliver designs that meet them where their head is anyhow. And then on the development side of things, we're moving from this really heterogeneous kind of environment where there's all these different browsers and all the nuance between them all to much more consistent and compelling kind of interfaces for building things out. So some nuts and bolts. So we saw those two needs. We realized we needed a new kind of library, a new code base to kind of help us do this. But we weren't done kind of thinking about it before we got to work. We spent a lot of time kind of planning it out, figuring what we wanted to do, how we wanted to go about it, kind of what our own requirements were for a successful project. And these are some of those. We kind of made 6 commitments to the company and now to the world when we started out doing this. The first of those is what we especially at Yahoo with a lot of existing websites, we had to meet people where they were today. We couldn't say throw away what you've got and start from scratch. Nobody's got time or budget, or that just doesn't make sense. So we couldn't expect people to download this massive new framework and rewrite everything from scratch. We kind of had to meet them where they were, facilitate this kind of incremental enhancement. So it's about rich internet applications, but it's also about these kind of traditional applications where you take an existing site and you add something like autocomplete to it. But at the same time, it had to be robust enough to really facilitate rich internet application development from scratch also. But we still didn't want to have a huge framework. We still didn't want to have all that overhead. We wanted people to be able to pick and choose what they needed. So throughout the library, we'll talk about this towards the end, we took an a la carte approach. So if you just need one component, you can just use that one component. If you just want autocomplete, you just use autocomplete. You don't have to download the whole boat with it. Then the third kind of commitment was to, or the third requirement, I guess, was to look across all of our properties and do things that made sense to everybody. We've got everything from music and movies and email and business applications. And so in all these different contexts, and then again around the world, kind of globally, we had to do stuff that made sense and was valuable to all those different kind of stakeholders, I guess. Browser support is still an immense challenge, and we've talked about our graded browser support kind of system or concept. And so the library, kind of unlike a lot of the ones, especially at the time, in general, support's gotten better over the last year and a half since we've been working on this in other competing libraries. But at the time, no other library really supported all the browsers that were important to us, what we call A-grade browsers. So we delivered against that. It's still a challenge, but that's all baked in. And then we're not a little mom-and-pop site. It's a pretty huge scale, huge scope, lots of users, lots of edge cases all over the world. And so it really had to tackle and perform well kind of in those contexts. So performance was a big issue, scalability, things like this. Basically, as it says there, an industrial-grade kind of library. And then finally, we have to be really responsive and accountable to the teams and to the users of the library. We can't just build something and walk away. It can't be kind of a fly-by-night shop. We have to be dedicated to all of our teams, be there when they need us. We're kind of an extension of their teams. We're doing work that other people will stand on top of. So if somebody who's using our library has a priority 1 bug pop up, it's a priority 1 bug for us, and we're fully committed to that 24/7. So a little bit about what we built, and again, if you were in my earlier sessions, you've seen a version of this diagram before. But we looked back at Alan Cooper's kind of book from About Face 2.0 about what he calls the canon of kind of GUI design. At the low level, again, are these kind of primitives, a simple click, a cursor, text entry. Moving up, more sophisticated compounds where you're having double clicks or right clicks or selection criteria, autocomplete again. And then up at the top, our designers take those building blocks and are able to build idioms from them. So the control click or the toolbars that you're familiar with, they're really property-specific, kind of case-specific, but they can be built from these lower-level pieces, these atomic and primitive kind of low-level chunks. So we started out at the bottom of this pyramid to build up to provide a good foundation, and we kind of built in this order. We built a DOM collection, which allows you to add and set classes and figure out where things are on the page regardless of what CSS context they're in. So even if it's floated left inside of floated right, inside absolute position, you can still reliably, 100% of the time, get the XY coordinates of that. We have an AJAX control, obviously, animation, drag and drop, event. These are the building blocks of modern interfaces. We also released 3 CSS libraries. We'll talk about grids a little bit more. That's the most interesting. But also a reset, which kind of normalizes the default rendering that different browsers have kind of pre-canned. So when an H1 tag appears big with margin underneath it, that's because of a browser-specific style sheet that's embedded in the browser. Those are a little bit different across all browsers, so we wanted to normalize that. So we reset all the CSS and then again build up from there. And then once we had that work done, we started building out these compound widgets. So we have a whole windowing system for doing panels and tooltips and kind of in-browser, sophisticated, layered windowing and dialogues. A menu control, tab view is our most recent one for having kind of more dense collections of data in a small screen real estate space. You won't actually see logger or loader kind of used anywhere because those are more infrastructure tools. But debugging JavaScript, developing JavaScript, there still aren't a lot of great tools for doing that, and so we had to build some of our own. So we have this logger control that lets you write debug messages in your scripts as you're developing them, and then pipe those out to either our logger control or directly out to Firebug. So in terms of bringing some more kind of sophisticated, just starting to build out some of the tooling that we need to really do DHTML development. And then everybody always asks kind of why we gave it away, why open source anything, how's that in our best interest? And it was actually really interesting when we finally did do that in February. It's been less than a year now. We got a lot of great press right away. We jumped to the top of Dig and Delicious and Memorandum and some other sites like that. And even Slashdot, who's notoriously a little tough of an audience, was pretty friendly to us. But there was kind of an underlying current in the comments on Slashdot that people were saying, this is pretty cool, glad they're doing it, and it seems good, but there's got to be some catch. I just can't quite figure out what it is. But there is no catch. We just wanted to get it out there, and here's some of the reasons why. As soon as we released it, we'd already been using it internally for about 6 months and developing it for about a year. But as soon as we released it, we got a legitimate bug report, I believe from Germany, within 24 hours. So as soon as you put more eyes on the problem, things get better. And that was the most kind of tangible kind of validation of what we were doing. Even if nobody else uses it in the world, if people are willing to help us make our code better, that's a clear win. So we have public bug tracking and also feature request tracking on SourceForge, which is where we distribute the code. So you can jump there and log bugs or look at other feature requests that people have added and kind of add your vote to those for what you'd like to see us develop next. And then the other reason is community. Open source is about kind of an open community, and a lot of people have been kind of adding value to the library since we released it. And I put added value in kind of italics because it's kind of a business word or a buzzword, but I didn't have a good synonym at the time. But anyway, the most notable is Jack Slocum. Have anybody seen any of the work he's done? He built a new comment system for WordPress and a bunch of other really nice components. Here's some of them. So his library is called Yahoo.extension or EXT. He built a grid component for doing kind of multi-column collapsible regions or panels and panes, like a split bar component, the WordPress comment system. Just this week, he released a resizable widgets thing. So just with one line of code, you can make anything, drag and drop resizable, any of your dialogues or panels. So he actually recently quit his job and is doing this full time, has a consulting business built up around supporting YUI library and his extensions to that. And the guy's amazingly prolific. He's kind of keeping the fire under us to keep up with him. But it's been great. And because everything was designed to play together, all this work integrates perfectly with ours. And it's just really a great example of the power of open source. Dave Glass is he's a Yahoo employee, but he does all this kind of on his free time. I've never known him to sleep at all. Most of his emails, and he has his own forum, and most of his emails onto our mailing list come at like 2 or 3 in the morning. But so he's written a bunch of things. He wrote a loader for pulling in kind of requirements in a more systematic way. Lots of effects. He's really trying to duplicate a lot of the effects that are kind of pre-canned with the Scriptaculous type library. And then a bunch more tools kind of extending some of the kind of the primitive functionality. And then he has this grid builder for our CSS grids component that we released. And I think I have this up here. I'll take a look. So our grid component, or it's not a component, our grid CSS file, CSS grids, allows you to really easily build kind of 1 to 10 column page layouts that are either fixed width or fluid width that work on all browsers and that weigh 2K. So you link to one 2K CSS file, and now you never have to think about doing multi-column layouts in CSS again. With just a few small tweaks of kind of HTML classes to indicate kind of which columns go where, all this happens. So here's his little wizard he built for it. So you can pick kind of what page width you're interested in. So here's a 950 fixed. You can figure out kind of where you want the sidebar to be. We kind of have these pre-canned widths in here, 160, 180, 300, 240, because those are the size of the Internet Advertising Bureau's kind of default advertising units. So as you standardize advertising, if you have advertising on your site, these are the dimensions you'll need to be able to put like an LREC or a Sky banner or something along those lines in the column. So that's the backstory on where that came from. So you pick your layout here, and then in the main area say, well, I want 3 columns, and I want another row underneath it with 2 columns kind of split. This is all from the same CSS file. We're just making small markup changes to indicate different divisions of content on the page. Things are source order independent too, so if you want one block of content to come before a different block of content, which is advantageous for both search engine optimization and for accessibility, this supports that functionality. The first version of it just had these kind of fixed width layouts, and initially it just had 750, but in the last release, I put in support for 100% kind of fluid layouts. So you've got all these same regions we just built, and now they just kind of work anywhere you go. So it's been a real thorn in the side of CSS developers for years, how to do all these page layouts in a way that kind of works reliably everywhere. And this 2K file kind of solves that problem for a vast majority of cases. But so we never got around to building that kind of wizard, and so we open sourced it, and somebody else did it for us. It was great. Dustin Diaz is kind of a web standardista, web standards kind of evangelist. He writes a blog at dustindiaz.com called Web Standards with Imagination, I think. And he's really done a lot of work helping us expand our documentation of the library. So he's got these phenomenal screencasts where you can walk step by step through kind of getting started with the library. So the first one there, kind of YUI Basics, is a 20-minute video of over his shoulder, watching him kind of get things going on the screen, showing you exactly what to do. And then up to much more complex ones, like developing a whole object-oriented web service. And then he's written a lot of articles going through similar things also, so trying to explain the power of a publisher-subscribe kind of custom event model when you're doing these really event-rich interfaces. And kind of for fun, as a personal challenge to himself, he decided to rebuild Tetris using the YUI library. So I think Tetris sent him a cease and desist. So I'm not sure it's up on his site right now, although I think he was trying to rename it or something so it would be okay. But he built Tetris. He said it took him 2.5 days, which isn't bad for a game like that in a web browser where we've all had struggles trying to develop software at all. He's done interviews with a bunch of folks on my team, and he's got a whole library of prototypes of different things he's kind of hacked together. He's kind of an enjoyable writer. I enjoy his writing style, so I encourage you to go read some of his things there. He writes about tons of other things besides YUI, but these are just some I pulled out that talked about our library. And then most recently, Ross, who's on the small business team at Yahoo, who uses TextMate as their IDE of choice on a Mac, maybe. So he released a bundle. I think that's the terminology in TextMate. So that now you add this little bundle into your TextMate installation, I guess, and it'll auto-complete all the libraries, give code completion, code look-ahead, syntax correction against all of our library. So if you are a TextMate user, I encourage you to download that. And here he's got a 9-minute screencast video of him showing how it works, showing the functionality and how to get it going. So when you open things up, you get all these other people contributing, and it's been a blast. And then the other reason is that we have this thing called the Yahoo Developer Network. And their tagline for a long time has been, you bring the skills and we bring the ingredients. And it started out as primarily a lot of web services. I think I have that here. And yeah, so our YUI library is just one part of this developer network, and I think really helps tell kind of the complete story. So these are some of the utilities and data web services that are available through the Yahoo Developer Network, and some of our execs have been talking about this ecosystem of kind of open development. So most recently, I just wanted to call this one out for a second. A few weeks ago, we released browser-based authentication. It's a bit of a, if anybody's familiar with identity, some of the identity federations out there trying to have kind of single sign-on across the whole web. There's great work going on there, and we're involved in some of those efforts and supporting all of those efforts. But in the meantime, we wanted to offer up kind of our single sign-on infrastructure. So now using this web service, you can have any of our 260 million users sign on to your website or your service or your intranet or your product using their Yahoo ID in a completely secure and private way. Some of the other ones are more simple, like a web service for search, like we saw at the keynote yesterday. All the wonderful things you can do with that, and then web services for an increasing number of our APIs, of our websites, with more coming just about every week. We did a pilot of Yahoo Mail as a web service, so now you'll be able to let users check their Yahoo Mail on your website or on your intranet, or display to your users their address book or their 5 most recent subject headings or something like that. We also have a lot of kind of quintessential Web 2.0 sites that are all wide open for you to hack and integrate into your own projects, so Delicious and Flickr, Upcoming for events, and WebJ for music and playlists. Hundreds of feeds for news and traffic and weather and finance and stocks and jobs and everything else. And then mainly we're a website, but we also have some pieces of software. So we have a music player, we have a Messenger client, and we have whole SDKs now that we've released for developing plugins for Messenger, other things like that. And then just to kind of raise the bar and expose some of the resources we're aware of, we've built development centers around technologies. So we have a .NET Development Center, a Ruby Development Center, Python, PHP, JavaScript. So that was kind of all existing there, and more over time. But those were kind of the data, the stuff for the hardcore geeks that we've exposed. But we wanted to tell kind of the whole, soup to nuts, the whole cover-to-cover story. So we also wanted to talk about some of our thinking about design. So we released at the same time, on the same day that we released our interface code library, we also released a design patterns library. Design patterns are, a solution to kind of a common problem, kind of an abstract solution to a common problem. We've got about 30 or 40 of them up here now. Here's a look at the autocomplete one. They each start with kind of a problem summary, and as you can see in the sidebar there, there's also a solution, rationale, notes about accessibility. How do you make something like autocomplete accessible, or at least not have it get in the way of accessibility? We link to where some of these design patterns are used across our network, and then each one has a corresponding blog article where we tell a little bit more of the context. And the last link down there in the sidebar is a direct jump link over to the actual code in the JavaScript library. So now you can grab some of our web services, you can think about what the design should be, and then you can get the code to piece it all together. So we've gone from design to back-end engineering to front-end engineering all in one place. And that, I think, was the primary reason we wanted to do to release this library, so we have this whole complete story. Here's looking further down that screenshot, suggestions about when you should use it, what a solution's going to look like, kind of things to keep in mind with the interaction. So there's actually a web service for the design patterns library also. We're trying to see how open we can be. So there's actually a JSON feed, so you can actually pull down all the data from the design pattern library and integrate it into your own internal library, mash it up with other design pattern libraries that are out there, do anything you want with it. This one's released under the Creative Commons attribute license. We also opened up our thinking about browser support, including our specific chart of which browsers receive A-grade support from Yahoo, and likewise from our library. So when you use any piece of our library, you get perfect support in all these browsers for free right out of the box. We update this quarterly. Let me jump back for a second. We update this every quarter. We track all our own stats, and make some other determinations. So every quarter, there's a post on the blog from me about what changes we have made to the browser support standards and what we're predicting for the next quarter. Question? Right, so the question is, when we no longer offer A-grade support to a particular browser, do we go back in and take out any particular branches we had in our code? The short answer is yes. The other answer is you could probably find a place where we haven't done it yet, but in general, yeah, I mean, we try to keep our libraries lean and as lightweight as possible. Yeah, philosophically, we're going in and removing everything. And that brings us to the Yahoo user interface library itself. This is kind of our landing page for it. And we've started to add a lot more material here. Most recently, we added the YUI Theater, which are video recordings of a lot of internal training sessions we have, or other guest speakers come. Joe Hewitt, the guy who develops Firebug, came and gave a talk at Yahoo a few months ago. We've recorded that, made that available. His talk was called 10 Things You Don't Know About Firebug, and I didn't know any of the 10, so I encourage you to check that one out, although I think it might be a little bit dated now that he just released the new version of Firebug yesterday. And then the final reason is really this kind of belief that a rising tide does really lift all boats. Kind of said another way, the way I like to say it more often is that if it's good for the internet, it's good for Yahoo. And we're such a big part of the internet that I just fundamentally believe that if users are having more fun online, if more interesting things are being developed online, if the expectations are being raised online, if people are all learning together and sharing everything online, that'll have some trickle-down benefit to us eventually. So just this notion that it's just good for the internet, and I think there's a lot of developers, a lot of designers who kind of have a strong attachment to the web philosophy, and I think that's mine. So then, so why you might like it, put another way, kind of FAQ. These are things that people often ask me, for a little bit more information about, as well as some things that kind of get overlooked that I wanted to take a few minutes to point out. First of all, if it's good enough for Yahoo, it may just be good enough for you guys too. Primarily because we just have so many people working on it, and it works at our scale, it works around the world. It's our best effort, and hopefully that has some value to other people also. Is there a question? No? One thing that's in some ways a little bit unique about our library is that we've invested a lot in the design of it, the visual design and the interaction design. Yahoo has a long history of having a strong user experience design department. We work really closely with them, even though we're an engineering group. We work really closely with design. It's kind of my job to facilitate that relationship. Almost everything in the library has gone through pretty extensive usability studies. We've conducted various types of research about it, figuring out exactly how many pixels you should move before a drag's initiated, different ways to show people where a valid drop target would be. These are complex things, and as we're trying to make users more familiar, there's a lot of ways to get it wrong. And so we've brought to bear our huge design department to help us work these things out. In the process, our code has gotten better, and also the end result has gotten better. And we've also come up with some new tools for designers. So I mentioned grids before, and if you're doing mock-ups, if you're just putting together a quick prototype, just slapping it into one of those grids is a great way to get off the ground and running. But the one I wanted to talk about also is what we call interesting moments matrices. So in these more complex interactions, we're not talking about a single wireframe, click onto the next page. There's all these interesting moments when things are happening. And there's so many of them, and there's so many actors now on the stage of the web that we needed a way to kind of make sure we were thinking about all of them and answering all the questions that the interface needed to answer. So here's what that interesting moment matrix looks like for drag and drop. I know you can't really read it, but you can download it from our site. Down the left side there is it says page and cursor and tooltip, the drag object, the drag object's parent container, the drop target. And then across the top are these interesting moments, like what happens on page load? What happens when a drag re-enters the original location? Like how do you re-heal it into where it was before? Not just what happens in general, but what happens to the tooltip? What happens to the drop indicator? Kind of all these different questions. So here's an example. I blew one of them up. What happens when the mouse is pressed, but they haven't really started to move yet? Should I already show the drop indicators where the valid targets are or not? How do we, each of these boxes on a chart like this needs to be addressed to to end up with a result that actually feels right and that's taking care of kind of all the edge cases. So we've got these matrices for several of the components now. And internally, we find it's a really great tool for designers to help discover and define what should happen here. A simple, flat Photoshop mock doesn't really communicate because now we're operating over a time axis. So what happens at different parts of this storyboard? It was actually really fun developing these because it was a really collaborative process. As coders, we had built in what we thought were the interesting moments. What happens when I'm hovering over an invalid drop target? We built in something for that. But we didn't think about what happens to the tooltip. And so going back and forth with designers, we were able to discover kind of more of these questions we should be asking and to build those interesting moments into the library itself and into these tools for designers to communicate better. We're a global company, obviously, and so internationalization and localization is really important to us. And we've built in support for that into all these controls. So it's trivial to have the calendar render in Japanese or in German. Everything scales big enough to increase languages like German have much longer words on average than English words, whereas in Korea the characters are much taller than they are in Roman character sets. So kind of all those cases have been already addressed and kind of pre-baked in. I think that's one of the advantages you get when you're using a library that actually gets stressed across our scope. Another really similar example to that is accessibility. We talked about this in a dedicated session yesterday, but we really started to put these things into the library itself. Just within Yahoo, I kind of have two choices. I can go around to each team and I can teach them all about accessibility, and I can talk to their project manager and try to get time in their schedule to address accessibility, or I can just build it into the library they're going to use anyway and have them just get it all for free. And so that's really been the approach we've been taking. We were really lucky last year to hire a gentleman called Victor Zaran, who's now our accessibility project manager. He's an engineer by training. He's also blind. And so instead of just taking best guesses about kind of what works and what doesn't work, everything here goes through his gauntlet of tests, and it all works for him. So these aren't just kind of reading white papers and putting best practices in place. These are things that actually work for Victor. It's been really fun working with him. It's been cool. We're also working closely, I alluded to this a little bit yesterday, with the W3C's kind of accessibility initiatives. So we're really trying to be a part of this community. Some of these accessibility issues are really tough, and so we're really trying to work with all the other people out there. We'd love to work with any of you also. So some of this stuff's baked in yet. Some of it's still emerging. You're going to see a lot more of it in 2007. We're working on it this quarter a lot and first quarter of next year a lot. So calendar and slider and menu already have a lot of this built in. We're going to be rolling this into all the other libraries in the coming months. Set it and forget it for any Ron Popeil fans. You just get this browser support because it's there, and we've built it in. Also, kind of because of our position, we're able to talk to all the browser vendors in person. So we've got speed dials for Microsoft and Opera and Safari and all the other guys. And so kind of when we have issues, we can go meet with them and figure out what their roadmap is, figure out the best way to make all these things work on all the different browsers. So I know a lot of people don't spend tons of time testing on Opera, even though I believe you should. But now if you use this library, you never have to think about Opera. It'll just work for you automatically. And this kind of blew my mind. I installed Opera Mobile my coworker Steven installed Opera Mobile on his new kind of smartphone. And we loaded up the library and we were playing with it, and the drag and drop just works on the mobile phone. So I'm not sure why you'd really necessarily need drag and drop on the mobile phone. But because we've baked the support in, we didn't do anything else. We didn't do any retrofitting. We didn't plan on that. We didn't design that. But because we're supporting web standards, we're supporting all these browsers, all this stuff just works on a mobile phone too. I don't recommend using it that way, but it's there and kind of a good testament to I think, the approach we've taken. So there's a lot of great JavaScript developers out there. I'm a big fan of Alex Russell and the guys at jQuery and the other libraries. But we're really lucky to have Douglas Crockford on our team. He's the architect, JavaScript architect at Yahoo. And Brandon Ike, the gentleman who invented JavaScript in the first place, calls Douglas the Yoda of JavaScript. So he's the one kind of steering our ship. He's not on our team per se. He's kind of architect for the entire company. But when we're figuring out kind of which inheritance models to use and which programming conventions to follow, which object-oriented conventions to follow, he's the one kind of guiding that ship. And it's really a good feeling for us to know that we have this really senior level leadership. I share a cue ball with Rasmus, the guy that invented PHP. And so he's not a real JavaScript hacker, but he's giving us advice on how to, on different programming models to use, different ways to think about memory management. Just a smart, talented guy. And he's been a big advocate of our library. He uses it as examples in a lot of his PHP talks around the world. But so he's kind of our reality check. If it's good enough for him, if it's good enough for those two guys, we're on the right page. And then we've gotten a lot of press for the documentation we've built into this library. It's not particularly fun writing documentation, but it's been a priority for us since day one. We've got about, probably 8,000 developers at Yahoo, and so, 6,000 or 7,000 or 8,000 developers. And I don't have time to answer all their instant messages personally, so it's worth it to kind of have this good documentation in place. And it's been really rewarding to see that kind of noticed out in the public also. So we've got all different types. So depending on what format you're interested in or what kind of background you have or what level of JavaScript expertise you have, I think we've got some documentation that's well suited to you. So for each page on our website, or for each library page, there's an overview, there's a quick start guide. You can cut and paste which lines to include to get started, to get a quick sample up and running. We have kind of really narrative, kind of step-by-step tutorials for how to implement autocomplete with a JSON data source over XHR. Really kind of just step-by-step. We've got Java doc style kind of API documentation. We've got cheat sheets, which are kind of a graphical one-page posted up on your office wall. We've got our mailing list, and we've got these bundles. I mentioned the bundle for TextMate. We also have one for Vim and for Eclipse and for Aptana, some other kind of popular development IDEs. So here's a screenshot from, this is how to, kind of a nice paragraph telling you exactly what's going on when you're trying to determine the maximum number of results displayed in the autocomplete widget. So for basically every line of code, we kind of have this paragraph per line of code documentation for all kind of the quick start things you need to get off the ground. This is the API documentation. So if you're used to Java doc or some kind of generated documentation, automatically generated based on the comments in the code, this is the result of that. There's a tool called JSDoc that does this a little bit, but with some of our inheritance models, it wasn't picking up all the information. So we wrote our own and plan to release that in our first release of 07. But all the information that it generates is out there right now. So you can see what the constructor looks like, what parameters are expected or optional, and all the methods for each library. It's also a good way of getting help. Because each method is a permalink in this system, you can send that, you can have a direct link to exactly what you're talking about. Here's kind of the narrative, how to use the panel, which is part of the DHML windowing, the container family of controls, how to use that to create a light box or a photo box effect. So we kind of have step-by-step over here, and then you can see a functional kind of standalone example if you prefer to reverse engineer it that way. Here are those cheat sheets, and have to give credit to whoever runs the I Love Jack Daniels website. How many people have printed out some of his cheat sheets over the days? He's got them for JavaScript and HTTP access and everything else. But so we kind of stole his format a little bit. We gave him credit, but stole his format. And now we have one of these cheat sheets for each and every component in our library. So if you walk around the Yahoo campus, you see these kind of rainbow of colors posted up on quite a few cue balls. it doesn't have the full, it doesn't tell you everything in every case, but it's really the stuff you're going to need 90% of the time. And a great quick reference. I mentioned the mailing list. This is the best place to come to get support. We've got about 4,000 people on this mailing list. It's at ydn-javascript. It's a Yahoo group. You can browse the web archives. You can search against it through the web interface, or you can join the group and post questions. My team spends hours a day responding personally to all the questions on this list. We popped a bottle of champagne, metaphorically, the first time somebody out in the public answered one of the questions for us. We had just been spending hours a day answering every single question, and then somebody else chimed in and answered one for us, and we were pretty stoked. But we still spend tons of time every single day answering questions here. It's a great place to come and to ask and to show what you're working on, to show examples, to see other implementations, and to be part of the community. And finally, I think it's worth noting that we have a dedicated team of people working on this full time, and that these are the exact same lines of code that power Yahoo today. So the homepage of Yahoo, the biggest page on the web, 5.2 billion hits, blah, 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 is running off the exact same lines of code that you can download in this library. And kind of because of that, I think it's a pretty safe bet that this isn't going to kind of fade away. This isn't just a fad. This isn't kind of just a whim. This is actually a key part of Yahoo infrastructure. We've got a team of sharp people working on this full time, and it's going to stay that way. All of our stuff counts on it, and so you guys can count on it also. Somebody started using this phrase recently, page citizen, like I'm a good or I'm a bad page citizen. And kind of what this means is, if I put this on a page, people are adding stuff to their MySpace page or pulling in, a Google video search or linking in some other control. And you want things that aren't going to break other things. And we take that very seriously because we have to for all of our sites, but also because we want to for the world. So all of our stuff exists under a single global variable. It all exists under the Yahoo object. Douglas teaches us that global variables are evil in his words, and that every application or every website should only use a single global variable. So all of our stuff is namespaced under here, which allows it to coexist on the page with just about anything else. So you can have Dojo and Prototype and YUI living on the same page and not getting in the way. A lot of people are fans of the dollar variable for document or for get element by ID that I think Prototype made famous. So we exist in this namespace, which gets a little long-winded sometimes. So if you are a fan of that $sign variable, that's the only thing you have to do to be able to use that in a YUI context. And there's a couple schools of thought with JavaScript libraries. There's one school that says JavaScript is crazy and insane, and I don't want anything to do with it. I'd rather write Java and have somebody else worry about the JavaScript. And then there's our school of thought that says JavaScript's a key component of the internet, and that we need to come to terms with that, and not come to terms with it, but we need to embrace that and not kind of run away from it. So what we try to do is we try to normalize all the madness. So now a pixel is what a pixel is, and you can get this collection of nodes, and you don't have to worry about the scope of where the event scope is going to be or what the this is pointing to. We normalize all those things, but we still expect implementers to write a significant amount of JavaScript to kind of bring these things to life. JavaScript's a really powerful, a really expressive language, and it's driving this kind of new wave of internet development. So we want to really embrace that, not shield people from it. One of the most common criticisms we receive is about page weight. People think our library is bloated. I think the reason for that conception is that we offer multiple versions of each file. I showed you the JavaScript documentation, the API documentation, which is automatically generated based on the comments that we have in our files. So this fully commented version is huge because it has pages and pages of documentation pretty much baked into it. So I think when people download the library, they look at that file and they say, why would I want a 70K event utility? But we also ship a minimized version, which has all of that stripped out, white space compressed, things like that, which is much, much lighter, as we'll see on the next slide. And then we also release a debug version for each one, which has some of these debugging messages built in. So you can toggle between the minimized version and the debug version if you run into a problem. and all of a sudden the library will start spitting out lots of comments right to Firebug or right to the JavaScript console in your browser, so you can kind of track what's going on and see what the objects are looking like at a given time. So I think that's kind of why people had this misconception, and I think actually we're a really light library because of our a la carte approach I mentioned earlier. There's really no unnecessary dependencies. If you're not using drag and drop, why would you want to include that on your page? There is no unnecessary overhead. And in this last release, last month, we started releasing pre-concatenated versions of common files. So 95% of the Yahoo users use event and DOM together. So even though we offer those individually, you can just download event or you can just download the DOM utility. Most times you want to use both of those. And so we offer those as one single concatenated file, which lets you reduce by 1 your HTTP request count on your page, which will speed things up. So here's kind of what it looks like as we offer those 3 different versions of the files. The drag and drop utility on the far right there is, not sure if you can read the numbers, but it's 84.5K fully uncommented. When you minimize it, when you strip out all the comments, it drops to 21K. And when you gzip, compress it over the wire, it drops to 5.9K. So now for under 6K, you can enable drag and drop on your site if you want to. The event utility, which has an immense amount of pretty cool functionality, can be yours for like 3.2K. So those little purple lines, which you can barely see, are kind of the actual file weight when you pull these things in a la carte. And even the most complex thing, using all the possible optional components on the far right here, the container family of controls for doing panels and overlays and things of that nature. Even if you're including animation to make it kind of expand and breathe, and if you're including connection to populate it with an XHR request, and if you're including drag and drop to make it movable around the page, even then, even with all those optional dependencies, it's still just 30.9K, which is smaller than the masthead logo on 9 out of 10 blogs out there. So even the most rich and sophisticated object that we release is 30K. Yes. The CSS files, I told you could have 200 plus layouts from a single CSS file. It's about 2.5K. If you gzip that, it's 0.6K. So never worry about CSS layouts again in exchange for 0.6K. This is all released under the most open license there is, as far as I can tell. I'm definitely not a lawyer, but I spent a lot of time with them in the 6 months leading up to this release and pushed hard for this license. You can do anything you want with it, commercial, non-commercial. You can tear it apart. You can build it back up. You can integrate it with your own work. We don't care at all. That's what the BSD license says in my terms. So yeah, have at it. So I didn't want to talk too much about the specific kind of the minutia of each library, but I want to call it a few little things. As we start doing more of these event-driven interfaces, we're taking advantage of all these DOM events. So what happens on hover and on load and on all these other kind of events that are built in. But those aren't all the events you really want to worry about. And so we've built in a mechanism for doing custom events. So now you can wire up custom events into your controls and then use a pub subscribe method model for listening for those events. So one example of that is you have a menu control, and you want something else on the page that doesn't necessarily know about the menu, or the menu doesn't know about that, to be able to respond. So now in the menu control, you can create a new custom event called onMenuCollapse and fire that event. And unbeknownst to menu, anybody else on the page who is subscribed to that event gets notified of it. And so then they can fire off events or fire off kind of programming on their own. So we're still figuring out the best ways to kind of exploit this, but it's a really powerful model in almost all programming languages. And we've brought it to JavaScript through the event utility. In all of our things, how many people have put a div on a page over a select box and seen the select box poke through in IE, right? The model's not there, and you have to do all this crazy, either you have to hide the form while the menu's coming down over it or something else. We've taken care of that in all of the components where it makes sense. So the fix for that is to put a little iframe behind it, because an iframe is opaque enough to prevent the form from shining through. So in situations where the library determines that's viable, particularly IE6, it'll automatically generate this iframe, put it behind your calendar, for example, and bind it to the calendar. So even if you drag it and drop it, kind of around the page, no matter what it goes over, it'll be prevented. It'll prevent that background stuff from shining through. So we've just taken as many of these kind of frustrating things that we've all banged our head against over the years and just kind of built them in so that people can spend their time doing much more interesting things than reinventing all these really square wheels. The event is really, events are really the key to having DHTML and kind of rich interfaces. And the event utility that we offer, I think, is one of the best out there. It has really flexible assignment. So instead of saying div 1, div 2, div 3, you can just have an array of these divs and pass in an array and have it apply those, have it attach those events to a whole array or a whole collection of objects at the same time. You can also do it with an object reference or with a string, just with the ID itself. But being able to take a whole collection, so enable, for example, saying get element by class. So I want to get all the nodes that match this class. Get elements by class is another, is in the DOM utility. But so you can say get all the nodes on the page that match this class, and for all of them, attach this event to it. So you can do that in 2 lines of code instead of having to go back through and do it in 100 lines of code. One problem with attaching events, though, is kind of this race condition. Like you can't attach an event to something until it exists on the page. So if you have if you're dynamically creating some content on the page and you're trying to attach an event to that before it's there, you'll see that common JavaScript error pop up. So we solve that in 2 ways. We have a method called onAvailable. So now instead of saying attach this event right away and running into that error, you say attach this event as soon as that node is available. So that's kind of the default attachment model we use now. It does it through really an impatient kind of polling mechanism. It'll just keep waiting. It'll look for it. If it's not there, it'll trap the error and keep trying until that node does exist, until it can put it on the page. IE has some interesting things in terms of scope. Depending on how you attach your events, this pointer won't necessarily point to the object that you're expecting it to. This library automatically does that scope correction for you so that this always points to the object you would expect it to in a normal system. We talked in my first talk yesterday about memory management. And the important thing to do for memory management is to carefully unhook all of these events that you've attached, all these handlers you've attached to objects, both when the object is no longer there and also when you leave the page. All of that cleanup happens automatically if you've used the event utility to apply those things. So you still want to be monitoring your memory consumption, but by using the event utility, 99 out of 100 of those cases go away. And then I mentioned custom event. Here's kind of what that syntax looks like. So no matter what, you're creating your new object there, and you register a custom event, and then something else on the page can subscribe to it, and then you just fire off the event when it happens, and that event then is propagated out to anybody who's subscribed to it. This is the interface for the animation utility, and we iterated over this a few times, trying to come up with an interface that was easy to read and also kind of terse and elegant. And so there's kind of 3 different words you can do, and they're described here on each line. And the first line says width to 400. So it doesn't care what the initial width is. It just says move it, make the width 400, move to 400. Height, the same thing, except instead of saying to 400, we're saying by 400. So take whatever the current width is and increase it by 400. The default units are always pixels, but for anything you can go in and specify what those units should be. And if you don't want to start with the default value, you can say from and to. That's an optional kind of parameter. So instead of taking the default value, you can actually tell it where to start from and where to end. For those of you who use Adobe Illustrator, familiar with the Bezier controls, the whole notion of Bezier math, we've built in Bezier math support into animation too. So now you can do very complex curves and paths with your animations based on Bezier math controls. And we actually use this to do things like acceleration and deceleration. So you can put a couple Bezier checkpoints in here, and now instead of just going at a consistent speed, it'll go and slowly settle into some place, kind of ease in or ease out. All that acceleration, as well as kind of different geometric shapes, are supported by this Bezier math. And then the final thing, I don't think it's really on this slide, is talking about time. Animation is obviously related to time, and the default way to think about time when you're programming JavaScript is in terms of frame rate, or how many frames should it take to get there? How many kind of key steps are there to get there? The problem with that approach, though, is that all the browsers go at much different speeds based on the browser itself, based on the user's CPU, and based on the complexity of the page. If I'm dragging 20 things at once, there's less horsepower to process each of those, and so things are going to bog down. And we didn't really want that. We wanted to say this yellow fade technique should take a half a second regardless. Firefox goes around 80 frames on a control sample, and Safari goes around 200 frames a second in kind of a simple test case. And so if we said to go in 10 frames, it would be this widely divergent amount of time. So we've built in self-correction into the animation utility, so you can specify things in time, and it'll automatically monitor and recalibrate along the way. So if your page is getting bogged down by too many objects or by some other background process eating up the user's CPU, it'll start dropping frames in the middle to guarantee that it ends in the exact amount of time you programmed it to end in. XHR or AJAX is, you can do it in a couple lines of code, but you're not going to solve all the edge cases when you do that. So Thomas Shaw on our team, he's the director of our team, he authored the connection utility. It's really ironclad now. We've uncovered some really kind of mind-numbing, strange bugs that he had to solve. All that intelligence is baked in here. And then most recently, we added the ability to do file uploading via XHR. So included in the connection library is the ability to have people upload images or upload files or post forms, or to do all this file uploading. So you won't find that in every AJAX library out there. And then the other thing is that XHR doesn't have natively an ability to have a callback, to have an argument passed to the callback. It's usually just success or failure. So we've added in some plumbing now so that you can pass in an extra argument to your callback function at the same time that you're initiating your AJAX request. This is kind of the object model from the connection or the container family. At the lowest level is module, and this has things like that iframe, shim protection, as well as understanding of where the viewport is, so you can prevent things from being dragged off the viewport, or you can optionally tell draggable things to initiate page scrolling or not. So all that's inherited from the module class, and then trickles down to things like tooltip and panels, dialogues, and simple dialogues, which are pre-wired to be kind of yes-no decisions. So you can have an OK cancel with just 1 or 2 lines of code. We talked about interesting moments earlier, and that's what I wanted to call out about drag and drop. It's sort of easy to start programming a drag and drop implementation, but it's really easy to get it wrong. And so like I said, we've gone through a kind of rigorous design process to come up with what we think are the interesting moments, and exposed all of those. We mentioned the logger and how it talks to Firebug now. We mentioned CSS grids already. I just want to tell you a couple people who are using it so far. It's open source. We have a really hard time figuring out who is using it. There's no requirement that you tell us if you are using it. And I know a lot of people are using it on intranet sites and things like that. But Wall Street Journal used it in their latest redesign for their personalized interface. Technorati has it in a few places. Stickit's a new site that came out a few weeks ago for their tagline is notes. They're post-it notes the way they're supposed to be or something. Sugar CRM is the largest open source CRM project. PayPal and eBay are both doing some pilots. So some big players are starting to use this library, as well as dozens and dozens of smaller and personal projects. Thank you.